June 4, 1942. Done in 22 a.m. over the vast blue emptiness of the Central Pacific, the morning sun glared off the ocean like a sheet of molten glass. The humid air shimmered. Below, a few scattered clouds floated over the lonely specks of coral that made up Midway Atoll, an isolated outpost halfway between Asia and America. To the Japanese, it was supposed to be the next easy conquest. To the Americans, it was the line they would not let break. High above, at 19,000 feet, a formation of HED-3A VAL dive bombers from the carrier Akagi sliced through the sky, their pilots confident, calm, and certain. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled the Pacific for 6 months. Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the loss of the Philippines. Victory had become routine. Commander Chuchi Nagumo, aboard his flagship, believed Midway would fall the same way, swiftly, decisively, beautifully orchestrated. But beneath that calm surface, something was wrong. At 5:30 a.m., Japanese reconnaissance had sighted what they thought was a single U.S. carrier. In reality, there were 3. Enterprise Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, repaired in a miraculous 72 hours after Coral Sea. They were waiting, silent and unseen, guided by a sliver of intelligence that would tilt the entire Pacific War, the cracked Japanese code JN-25. While Nagumo's crew rearmed his planes for a second strike on Midway, the Americans were already in the air. From the decks of Enterprise and Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, had launched into history. No escort, no fighter cover, just slow-moving Douglas TBD Devastators, flying low over an ocean crawling with Japanese destroyers. By 19:20 a.m., Waldron's squadron was sighted by Japanese lookouts. What followed was slaughter. One by one, the Devastators were torn apart by Zero fighters, their fragile aluminum wings shredded, their torpedoes sinking uselessly into the sea. Out of 15 men, only 1 survived. Waldron's last transmission: "We'll go in. We won't come back, but we'll make them notice us." They did. 10,000 feet above the chaos, the Japanese carrier decks buzzed with activity. Fuel lines snaked across the surface. Bombs were scattered, half-armed, as deck crews rushed to swap torpedoes for armor, piercing bombs, to counter whatever American carrier dared challenge them. They thought they had minutes, they had seconds. At 10:22 a.m., the sky above them screamed. Out of the blinding sun, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown plunged at near vertical angles. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had gambled everything on a hunch, a faint oil trail leading northwest. That decision changed the war. Dive brakes open, altimeter spinning. Each Dauntless hurtled down at 250 knots, the pilots pinned against their harnesses as the Pacific horizon twisted upside down. Tracer rounds rose from Japanese ships, red arcs of death. McCluskey aimed straight at the carrier Kaga, his voice calm but electric. "Pick your target. Dive and fire." In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Kaga Akagi and Soryu, were struck by cascading walls of flame. Bombs detonated among refueling aircraft. Fuel lines ignited like fuses. Black smoke coiled upward, blotting out the sun. The Imperial Navy's proud strike force, the same that had leveled Pearl Harbor, was being consumed before Nagumo's eyes, and the sea, moments ago a mirror of tranquility, now burned with floating fire. Somewhere over that inferno, American pilot Dusty Clyce pulled out of his dive, canopy rattling, the shockwave pounding his chest. He looked back and saw the impossible. A Japanese carrier engulfed in orange fire, her crew leaping into the sea. "I could see men running on deck," he later wrote, tiny black dots against a sheet of fire. The war had just turned. By noon 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu, would be gone. 4 floating fortresses erased in a span of 6 hours. The Japanese fleet, once the master of the Pacific, was blind, crippled, and burning. The men who began the day laughing at Midway now watched the ocean devour their empire's pride. And the Pacific, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, whispered a new sound, the crackle of burning steel and the echo of destiny turning. In the spring of 1942, Japan stood unchallenged. From Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies, from Burma to Rabaul, the rising sun had conquered an empire greater than any Japan had ever dreamed. The Imperial Japanese Navy IJN, with its 6 fleet carriers and battle-hardened aviators, was the most powerful striking force on Earth. They had smashed the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, humiliated the Allies across the Pacific, and driven the remnants of American naval power eastward in retreat. To Tokyo, the Pacific looked like a map already painted red. The next phase was to eliminate America's remaining carriers, draw them into battle, and destroy them once and for all. That plan was named Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll, a seemingly insignificant cluster of sand and coral. Midway was strategically priceless, the last American base between Hawaii and Japan's Pacific Empire. If Midway fell, Hawaii would be next, and the Pacific War might end before it truly began. The architect of this vision was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. A brilliant strategist, Yamamoto had warned against war with the United States, but now, he sought a knockout blow before America's industrial might could awaken. He believed Midway would lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap, where the superior Japanese fleet would annihilate them in a single decisive engagement. On paper, the plan was flawless. 4 of Japan's finest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway, drawing the Americans into battle. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and a screen of destroyers would shield them. A separate invasion force would seize the atoll itself. Farther back, Yamamoto's own main body, with the mighty Yamato, waited to crush any surviving American resistance. The Japanese had done this before, at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea at Ceylon. They believed the Americans would react predictably, too late and too weak. Their pilots were veterans, their tactics honed to perfection. As Admiral Nagumo's staff officer boasted, the Americans are amateurs in naval air warfare. Their courage cannot make up for their clumsiness. Arrogance had settled over the Japanese fleet like a morning fog. But the Americans weren't guessing. In a small, windowless basement at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, a handful of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had cracked Japan's secret naval code JM-25. By May 1942, they could read enough of the enemy's communications to identify AF as the next target, Midway. To confirm it, they staged a ruse. Midway sent an unencrypted message reporting a failure in their freshwater system. Hours later, Japanese intercepts reported that AF is short of water. The trap was set. The Americans knew when, where, and how Japan would attack. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made a daring decision. He would gamble everything. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, would ambush the Japanese near Midway. The odds were desperate: 3 carriers against 4, with fewer aircraft, less experience, and half the combat strength. But this time, knowledge outweighed numbers. In Nimitz's war diary, a quiet line captured the gravity of that choice. The enemy knows we are weak, but he does not know that we know. By late May, both fleets were moving toward each other across 3,000 miles of ocean. For the Japanese, it was a march toward triumph. For the Americans, it was a march toward survival. Every pilot, every deck crew, every gunner aboard those carriers felt it. The Pacific, once limitless and silent, was about to witness the most decisive carrier battle in history. A battle fought not for land or honor, but for the future itself. And in that future, one truth would burn brighter than any explosion that day: intelligence, courage, and chance could turn even the smallest atoll into the hinge of an empire. The Pacific War was not just a contest of men and courage. It was a duel of machines and doctrines, forged in opposite philosophies of warfare. To the Japanese, the aircraft carrier was a floating temple of precision and discipline, an extension of the samurai code itself. To the Americans, it was an instrument of improvisation and adaptability, a weapon that could evolve faster than fear could spread. The Japanese war machine, the 4 Japanese carriers that sailed toward Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were the heart of the Kido Butai, the world's most powerful carrier striking force. Each vessel carried around 70 aircraft: the sleek A6M0, the sturdy D3A Vile dive bomber, and the deadly B5N Kate torpedo bomber. Their pilots were elite, products of an unforgiving pro-war training pipeline that washed out 90% of applicants. Those who survived became legends, masters of aerial choreography, attacking with clockwork precision. Their doctrine prized perfect coordination, a symphony of timing where every bomb fell in rhythm. But perfection demanded control. That rigidity, that need to execute flawlessly, left no room for chaos, no space for adaptation. The American carriers facing them were 3 American carriers, each a floating city of iron and invention. The USS Enterprise, CV-6, known as the Big E, was a veteran of the early Pacific raids. The USS Hornet CV-80, still new to the war, had just launched the audacious Doolittle raid on Tokyo weeks earlier, and the USS Yorktown CV-5, limping from Coral Sea, had returned to service in an engineering miracle. Her hull patched, her decks rearmed, her boilers replaced in just 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. Her crew called her a ghost ship. Her enemies would soon learn she was very much alive. The Americans carried fewer planes, roughly 230 against Japan's 248, but their doctrine had evolved. The U.S. Navy had begun integrating radar for early detection, voice radio coordination, and new combat air patrol tactics. Their dive bombers, the Douglas SPD Dauntless, were slow, rugged, and built like anvils. But they could dive nearly 70 degrees, dropping their 1,000-pound bombs with sniper precision. Their torpedo bombers, the TBD Devastators, were outdated and sluggish, yet they carried the courage of men who understood sacrifice. As one American pilot said, "Our planes might be old, but they still drop hell." Doctrine and discipline. Japanese carrier doctrine relied on centralized control. The flagship Akagi coordinated launches and recoveries across the fleet. Their crews worked the flight decks in bare feet for better grip, their movements rehearsed to seconds. Efficiency was sacred, but this efficiency came at a cost. Aircraft were refueled and rearmed on deck, exposed to danger to save minutes. It made them fast and fatally vulnerable. American carriers, on the other hand, fought decentralized. Each ship acted on its own initiative, guided by broad orders but flexible in execution. It was messy, even chaotic, but in chaos lay survival. When one commander faltered, another filled the void. When communication failed, instinct took over. The human machines for both sides, the men were as vital as the steel beneath them. Japanese airmen like Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, commander of Hiryu's torpedo squadron, embodied professional honor. He flew despite being wounded at Coral Sea, his arm still stiff, his aircraft riddled with shrapnel repairs. American aviators like Wade McCluskey, Dusty Cleese, and Clarence Wally McCluskey, no relation, carried none of that polish. They were farmers' sons, engineers and adventurers, men who learned by doing, not by reciting. Their machines reflected them. The Zero was graceful, deadly, and delicate, unmatched in maneuver but fragile as glass. The Dauntless was the opposite, blunt, stubborn, and nearly indestructible. It could take hits, dive through chaos, and still deliver its payload. It was, in every way, the American spirit cast in rivets. By early June, these machines and men had set their courses toward one another. 2 doctrines, 2 worlds, racing to a collision neither fully understood. In the sky over Midway, the laws of engineering and the limits of pride would be tested not by theory, but by fire, and the machines, once worshipped as tools of domination, would soon decide the fate of empires. One dive, one explosion, one heartbeat at a time. June 4, 1942, 07:10 hours. The morning light had turned the Pacific into a mirror. On the bridge of the Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo studied the reports laid out before him, fragments of what seemed like victory. Midway's airfield had been bombed, its defenses crippled, its air cover scattered. His staff officers smiled. They believed the Americans had fallen into the trap. But below the polished decks, Japan's perfection began to unravel. Reconnaissance error. A single scout plane from Tone, delayed by 30 minutes at launch, had just spotted what might be an American carrier. The report came late, too vague. Nagumo faced an impossible decision. Should he strike Midway again, or rearm for a carrier battle? He hesitated. He ordered his bombers rearmed with anti-ship ordnance, then reversed the order minutes later. Below deck, confusion spread like fire. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines lay exposed across the hangar decks. Volatile waiting. A Japanese officer later wrote, "It was a beautiful disaster waiting for a single spark." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles east, that spark was already airborne. From the American carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, wave after wave of aircraft rose into the pale sky. Some pilots flew with incomplete coordinates. Others never found the enemy. But Torpedo Squadron 8 under Lt. Camdra, John C. Waldron, pressed on. His orders were simple: find the Japanese fleet. Attack at once. At 09:20, Waldron's squadron sighted the Japanese carriers and charged. 15 TBD Devastators dove to sea level, skimming the waves, torpedoes slung under their bellies. Above them, the sun flashed on the wings of descending Zeros. In minutes, the sky became a storm of tracers and smoke. Waldron's voice crackled through the radio, calm but final. Just follow me. We'll go in together. They went in. One by one, their planes burst into flames. Every Devastator was destroyed. Every man lost, save one Ensign George Gay, who floated for hours among the wreckage, watching the battle unfold. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been dragged low, chasing the torpedo planes, leaving the sky above them unguarded. 10:20 a.m., 19,000 feet above, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by LT Marder, Wade McCluskey, had been circling, fuel running dangerously low. He had lost contact with the Japanese fleet and was minutes from turning back. Then he saw it, a thin line of shimmering oil on the water, stretching toward the northwest. He followed it. Moments later, the horizon split open. 4 Japanese carriers, maneuvering below like sharks in a blue sea. McCluskey's decision, that sliver of intuition, would rewrite the Pacific War. He signaled the attack. The Dauntlesses peeled off, one by one, screaming down in near vertical dives. Dive breaks out. The cockpits shuddered as altimeter spun. The ocean twisted in their glass canopies, growing larger, closer, deadlier. At 7:22 a.m., bombs fell like thunder. The Kaga took 3 direct hits. One struck the flight deck amid rows of armed aircraft. Fuel and bombs ignited together. The blast tore through her hangar, sending fire through every level of the ship. Within seconds, the carrier was a column of fire. Nearby, Akagi turned hard to port. One bomb pierced her flight deck, detonating near her bridge. A single strike, perfectly placed, doomed the flagship of the Kido Butai. Within minutes, her engines died, her rudder jammed, and black smoke poured into the morning sky. To the northeast, Soryu was struck by 3 bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers. Each found its mark. Explosions rolled across her deck like thunderclaps, and men leapt into the sea as ammunition, cooked off in endless succession. Japanese officer Lt. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from wounds aboard a nearby cruiser, watched in disbelief. The shock was beyond words. Flames leapt higher than the masts. The pride of our fleet was being destroyed before our eyes. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. The deck crews, barefoot, disciplined, efficient, were incinerated by the very precision they had built. Fuel, bombs, ammunition, all of it perfectly arranged for catastrophe. By 10:30, silence followed the storm. The sea was littered with debris and men struggling in oil, slicked water. Overhead, the dauntless pilots pulled away, their eyes wide, their radios filled with static and disbelief. Ensign Dusty Kleiss, his voice steady on the recorder, said quietly, they were the same men who came for Pearl Harbor. Now, they were burning. The arrogance of Midway had met its reality, not in grand fleets or perfect formations, but in a handful of bombers, a few gallons of fuel, and a hunch followed through the sun. The Empire of Japan had just lost half its carrier force in 5 minutes. By 1100 a.m., the Pacific had become a furnace. 3 of Japan's proud carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, burned as black pillars on the horizon. Their decks, once models of efficiency, were now twisted skeletons of molten steel. The air reeked of cordite, burning fuel, and salt. The same fleet that had ruled the Pacific now watched in stunned disbelief as their empire's sword was broken in half. But the battle was not yet over. One carrier, Hiryu, still floated, untouched, her decks alive with desperate purpose. The counterstrike aboard Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, stood firm, his uniform immaculate despite the smoke drifting from the west. His voice was steady as he ordered, "We attack. As long as we breathe, we strike back." From her deck, 2 waves of counterattack launched. First, B-5N, Kate, torpedo bombers, led by the wounded but unbroken Lauti Joichi Tominaga. flew east toward the last known position of the American carriers. He flew knowing his aircraft had too little fuel to return. The rising sun on his wings gleamed crimson against the clouds, a symbol both defiant and doomed. At 1200 noon, they found their target, the USS Yorktown. Tomonaga's bombers came in low, threading through flak bursts and machine gun fire. Yorktown's gunners blazed away, her decks roaring with anti-aircraft fire. Still, 2 torpedoes struck home, one amidships, one forward. The great carrier lurched, smoke pouring from her hull. Yet her crew fought back with relentless discipline. Damage control parties sealed compartments, balanced the ship, and by 1300, Yorktown was back underway. To the Japanese, it seemed impossible. The Americans refused to die. A second blow, Yamaguchi's second wave, struck an hour later. Again, Yorktown was targeted. This time, dive bombers came screaming down through the flak, their sirens wailing over the sea. 3 bombs hit. Fire engulfed her decks. The order came, abandon ship. Smoke rolled across the waves as the crew slipped into the sea, clinging to rafts, staring at the carrier that had carried them through Coral Sea, and now into history. But even in her dying, Yorktown had done what she was meant to do. She absorbed the fury of Japan's last carrier, and in doing so, exposed Hiryu. The hunters become the hunted at 1600 hours. Scout planes from Enterprise sighted the last Japanese carrier, Hiryu, steaming north, her deck scarred but operational. Moments later, 40 dauntless dive bombers rose once more, guided by the calm precision of Lut Keemner, Clarence McCluskey and Lt. Earl Gallagher. They found Hiryu illuminated by the setting sun, the last survivor of Nagumo's once invincible force. At 1700 they dove. Bombs struck her amidships and aft, tearing through her hangars where freshly fueled aircraft waited to launch. In minutes, the same fate that had claimed her sisters found her too. Flames raged from bow to stern. The imperial flag still flying from her mast melted in the heat. Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship. He turned to his crew and said quietly, "Let us die with our ship. May Japan's future be bright." He went down with Hiryu. The echo of fear as night fell. The Pacific was filled with floating wreckage and survivors. Oil fires flickered like dying stars across the waves. Japanese destroyers moved silently, rescuing what men they could, executing others to spare them capture. Only hours before, they had been the most feared navy on Earth. Now, they searched for survivors in a sea that no longer belonged to them. Across the ocean, aboard Enterprise, the mood was somber. Victory had come at a terrible cost. Hundreds of airmen lost, dozens of aircraft shot down, the carrier Yorktown crippled beyond saving. Yet every man knew what had been achieved. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. The balance of power reversed. The pilots of the Kido Butai, once masters of the Pacific, now spoke of the Americans with quiet awe. Captured later, 1-0 pilot admitted, "At Midway, we learned fear. The enemy we mocked had learned faster than we imagined." And as the survivors drifted through the night, the flames of their carriers reflected in the waves. They understood that Japan's invincibility had died not in months, but in a single afternoon. The rising sun had set, swallowed by the smoke of its own creation. The once mighty Kido Butai, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was gone. Where there had been 4 carriers, now there were drifting hulks, their skeletons glowing faintly beneath columns of smoke that reached into the stratosphere. The Japanese fleet, blind and broken, retreated west. The ocean that had carried their empire forward for 6 triumphant months now carried back only ghosts. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the sky belonged to the Americans. The reversal of power at Midway Atoll, the small garrison that had endured bombing and fire the day before, now watched in stunned disbelief as the U.S. carriers returned, battered but victorious. Admiral Chester Nimitz, upon hearing the coded transmission from the field, "AF appears to be repeating its messages," smiled faintly. The codebreakers had been right. The risk had been worth it. America's counterpunch had landed with world-shaking force. In less than a day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 322 aircraft, and over 3,000 veteran airmen and sailors, the irreplaceable core of her naval air power. The United States had lost 1 carrier and 307 men. Numbers could not tell the full story, But they revealed a truth that echoed across the Pacific. Japan could no longer replace what it had lost. The ghost of Yorktown. The Yorktown, though mortally wounded, refused to die quietly. For 2 days she drifted under tow, her colors still flying, her crew rescued and her bulkheads creaking in the wind. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped through the destroyer screen and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck home. The great ship heeled to port, her stern rising, her decks sliding under the waves. As she sank, sailors saluted her from the lifeboats, the ship that had bought victory at Midway with her life. She joined the enemy she had slain beneath the same dark sea. The psychological tide in Tokyo, silence filled the Admiralty chambers. Messages from Nagumo's staff were curt, incomplete, almost unthinkable. All 4 carriers lost, many aircraft destroyed, fleet withdrawing. Emperor Hirohito's staff struggled to accept it. For months, Japanese propaganda had promised that the rising sun would never set, that the divine wind favored their warriors. But Midway was more than a defeat. It was the breaking of a myth. In Washington, by contrast, the mood was subdued but electric. President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the news with quiet satisfaction, saying only, "We've avenged Pearl Harbor," and turned the tide. At Pearl Harbor, where the rusting hulks of Arizona and Oklahoma still scarred the harbor floor, sailors cheered. They knew the war was far from over. But for the first time, it was their war to win. The fear spreads across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy pulled back from its forward positions. Plans for further expansion, to seize Fiji, Samoa, even Hawaii, were abandoned. Submarines replaced carriers on distant patrols. Every surviving pilot, every replacement crewman who took to the air after Midway knew the truth whispered in mess halls and wardrooms alike, "We can still fight, but never again like before." In later months, American bombers and fighters would begin to swarm across the skies of Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, and Rabaul, striking at once unreachable strongholds. For the Japanese, every sighting of SBD dive bombers, the same kind that had destroyed Akagi and Kaga, carried a chilling echo of that day near Midway. Among Allied pilots, a grim nickname spread, the Angels of Midway. The sky belongs to them. By late 1942, the Pacific was an American sea in all but name. The lessons of Midway had transformed U.S. naval doctrine. Carriers became the nucleus of new task forces, coordinated with radar scouts and relentless air cover. Industrial shipyards in California and Virginia began producing Essex-class carriers at a rate Japan could never match. What the Japanese had once wielded as a precise weapon, America now forged into an avalanche of steel and fire. The U.S. Navy no longer feared the sky, it owned it, and for every Japanese pilot who looked up into that vast blue expanse, there was the haunting image of that day, June 4, 1942, when their empire's proudest wings were torn from the sky in a single, blinding hour. The Pacific had chosen its new masters. By the time the fires of Midway burned out, the real weapon of the United States had already begun to awaken. Not a carrier, not a bomber, but industry itself. Japan had built her war machine upon precision and pride, the art of the craftsman. America built hers upon mass and momentum, the rhythm of 1,000 factories that never slept. The silent thunder of machinery in Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego would soon shake the Pacific more than any bomb could. The numbers of empire at the start of 1942, Japan could field just 10 fleet carriers. Each took years to build, with materials that were becoming scarce and crews that required the best aviators in the world. By contrast, in those same years, the United States built nearly 100 carriers, from the small escort types to the towering Essex-class giants. Each was faster, stronger, and more efficient than anything afloat in 1941. Factories that once produced automobiles and typewriters now turned out engines, propellers, and fuselage sections. At Grumman, engineers worked through nights under floodlights, hammering out wings for the new F-6F Hellcat. At Douglas, the successor to the Dauntless, the SB-2C Helldiver rolled from the assembly lines in endless rows. And in the skies above California, test pilots spoke of the new aircraft like omens of revenge. Every rivet was a promise. One Grumman worker wrote, "We built them faster than Japan could shoot them down." The industrial creed America's war machine became something elemental, steel, oil, and willpower bound together by a belief that freedom itself was worth mechanizing. In 1943 alone, the U.S. produced 85,000 aircraft and 65,000 tanks. Shipyards on both coasts turned out new destroyers every few weeks. The Liberty ships that carried fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts to the Pacific were built so rapidly that one could be completed in 4 days. Each crate, each bullet, each airplane wing carried the echo of Midway, a vow that no fleet would ever again threaten American waters. Japan, by contrast, faced an industrial drought. Her oil supplies from the Dutch East Indies dwindled. Her steel was rationed. Even aluminum, vital for aircraft, became scarce. Factories worked harder but produced less, choked by bombing, blockade, and exhaustion. Veteran engineers and machinists were drafted into the army. Apprentices took their places. The quality fell, and so did the planes. Training the next wave, perhaps the greatest loss of Midway, was not ships or steel, but men. The elite aircrews who had carried Japan's victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean were gone. In their place came boys with only months of training, barely able to handle their machines in combat. Meanwhile, across the United States, training command fields stretched for miles, from Arizona to Florida, filled with the steady drone of radial engines. Every new American pilot logged hundreds of hours before combat. Every mistake was corrected, every lesson passed forward. When these men took to the Pacific, they did so with a precision born of system, not superstition. "We don't make heroes," one Navy instructor said. "We make survivors who get the job done." The factory as battlefield. By 1944, the assembly lines had become America's front line. A rivet gun in Kansas was as vital as a machine gun on Saipan. The women who welded carrier deshings, the men who packed ammunition, the farmers who supplied their rations, all became soldiers in their own right. Propaganda posters declared, "The man behind the hammer strikes for freedom." And the hammer never stopped. When the new Essex-class carrier USS Yorktown, CV-100, steamed out of Norfolk, she bore the name of her fallen sister from Midway. It was more than symbolism. It was resurrection through production, a literal return from the sea. The avalanche unleashed. By the end of 1944, Japan faced an enemy it could no longer understand. Where once a handful of American carriers had patrolled the Pacific, now task forces of 10 or more swept across it, each covered by hundreds of planes. Their combined air wings, over 1,000 aircraft per group, could erase islands in hours. When the Marianas Turkey Shoot unfolded in June 1944, the U.S. Navy destroyed over 350 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The battle was not between pilots anymore. It was between systems. One system had been broken at Midway. The other was just reaching full power. The empire that built the sky, from the hum of assembly lines to the thunder of carriers at sea. The United States became the first true industrial superpower of war. Every shell that fell on Japan, every bomb that struck its cities, every fighter that soared above the Pacific traced its lineage back to that turning point in 1942. Midway was not the end. It was the ignition. The fire that consumed 4 Japanese carriers had lit the furnaces of an empire of production. The machines no longer served the war, they were the war. The sea around Midway Atoll is calm now. Beneath its blue surface, the twisted remains of Akagi, Kagasri, and Hiri lie silent, once the spearhead of Japan's naval might, now coral-encrusted tombs. Their shadows drift with the tides, their steel slowly dissolving into the ocean they once ruled. But the echoes of that June morning still ripple through history. For in just a few hours, the empire that sought to master the Pacific had been undone, not by luck, but by intelligence, resilience, and will. From triumph to tragedy for Japan, Midway became more than a defeat. It was a shattering of faith. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had warned that he could run wild for 6 months, received the news with stoic despair. He knew the truth before anyone dared to speak it. After Midway, I sensed that the war would not go as we wished. The Japanese people never heard those words. Censors buried the loss under vague reports of a minor setback. But in the mess halls and training fields, officers whispered the truth. 4 carriers, 4,000 souls, gone in half a day. It was the first crack in the rising sun, the American awakening for the United States. Midway was a revelation, the nation that had been struck at Pearl Harbor, humiliated, bloodied, underestimated, had proven its strength. A few squadrons of dive bombers, launched from fragile decks in the middle of nowhere, had rewritten the course of the Pacific War. It was not brute force that won Midway, but clarity of purpose. In the decades that followed, historians would debate the numbers, the codebreakers, the luck of timing. But those who were there, who saw the sky light up with burning fuel and falling wings, never forgot the feeling. It was as if the whole war turned over in a single breath. One American radioman remembered, "We saw the impossible happen, and we knew it wasn't over, but it was different now. The men who never came home, the victory came at a price. The U.S. Navy buried hundreds of its own that week. Some drifted in lifeboats that were never found. Others went down with the Yorktown, her flag still waving above the waves. The Japanese losses were even greater. Entire squadrons of veteran pilots vanished into fire and sea. Those men had once been the finest aviators in the world, trained from childhood in discipline and devotion. At Midway, they met an enemy who learned faster than they expected. The ocean kept them all without distinction, American and Japanese alike, swallowed by the same indifferent blue. Legacy of the machines that clashed at Midway became icons, not merely of war, but of transformation. The Douglas SPD Dauntless, ungainly and outdated on paper, earned its immortality that morning when it plunged through flak to strike 4 giants from the sky. Its pilots were not supposed to win, and yet they did. The Japanese A6M0, once a symbol of invincibility, became the last remnant of an era that could not adapt fast enough. Its wings were beautiful, but too fragile for a storm it could no longer survive. Each rivet, each bullet hole, each falling silhouette told the same story, how arrogance met innovation, and how innovation prevailed. Midway remembered today, the island remains quiet, a wildlife refuge surrounded by the bones of history. Tourists cannot go there easily. The coral runways lie cracked and faded, the bunkers overtaken by seabirds. But for those who study the war, Midway is sacred ground. It was where fate pivoted, not by chance, but by human resolve. In museums across America and Japan, relics of that battle rest under glass: a battered flight helmet, a dive bomber's compass, a fragment of carrier deck scorched black by aviation fuel. Each piece whispers the same truth, that courage, even when cornered, can alter the course of empires. From mockery to myth, the Japanese once believed the Pacific would be theirs forever. They laughed at the thought that America, wounded, reeling, could fight back so soon. But at Midway, they learned what the world would never forget, that underestimation can be fatal, and that even giants fall when pride blinds their sight. Midway was not just a battle, it was a turning point of destiny, written in fire upon the sea. And when the smoke cleared, the rising sun had begun to set. The Japanese thought Midway was theirs, until 4 carriers vanished in flames within hours, and the Pacific itself chose a new master.